ورحمة الله وبركاته. مرحبا بكم في اليوم الثاني لندوتنا
Peace be
الخامسة.
upon you and welcome to our fifth symposium in the series of the Islamic movements in governance and politics. Today we are going to speak about Iraq in this morning, and we have three panelists, three speakers.
أجلاء الأستاذ إبراهيم العبادي
Mr. Ibrahim Al-Abadi from the High Institute of Administrative and Security Development, and Mr. Saad Kubaisi, the head of the Jurisprudence Council abroad, and another speaker from Sakarya University in Turkey. Each paper will be speaking about one component of Iraq, because as you know, Iraq has a lot of components and it has witnessed a lot of developments in the past 20 years. The political development led to a sharp polarization in the country. Mr. Ibrahim, in his paper, will focus on the political Islam in Iraq and on the Shia component. Mr. Saad is going to speak about the Sunni Islamic movement in Iraq, about the challenges and the horizons in the future. And the third speaker will talk about the work of the political movements, Islamic movements in Kurdistan. Mr. Al-Abadi is a graduate of Al-Basra University. He has a diploma in psychology. He has a number of books, including the Ijtihad or discretion and the minds in the thought of Al-Khomeini, another book on the Islamic communities in the West, and dozens of other books and articles and studies. He is a lecturer in the High Institute for Security and Administrative Development in Iraq. Mr. Saad Kubaisi, he was born in Fallujah in Iraq. He has a number of books as well, and he has a PhD in Hadith and the higher purposes of Islam from Baghdad University, and he is associate professor since 2010 in the Baghdad University until 2017 in the sciences of Quran, and he taught in a number of universities in Iraq and outside Iraq. He is member of the International Association of Muslim Scholars, and he is a consultant with a number of institutions, and he wrote a number of books in politics, education, and Sharia. He also prepared a number of strategic plans for those institutions. He is the head of Institute of Waraqat al-Anbiya, and he is the chief and editor of a magazine or a journal that is published by the center. And he also has books between the scholar of the religion and the scholar of the state. This is one of his books. Mr. Othman Ali, professor, he is an associate professor in the Center of Middle East Studies in Sakarya University in Turkey. He was born in Kirkuk, and he joined the Mosul University. He studied there. He graduated from that university, from the Literature University. Then he moved to Canada, and he studied. He has a degree in Middle East Studies from Toronto University. He has a number of studies in English, Arabic, Turkish, and Kurdish languages, and he is published in a number of peer-reviewed journals in the United States and other areas, and he focuses on the Kurdish issue. After these presentations, Dr. Anas At-Takriti is going to comment on the papers. Dr. At-Takriti was born in Iraq. He is living in the UK for over half a century. In 2005, he established Cordoba Center as an independent think tank which thinks or studies the clash of civilizations, and he was the head of the Islamic Association in the UK in 2004, and he headed it in 2018. He has a PhD from Westminster University in London in political sciences. He is a pioneer, and he is known in the international movement for rejecting wars and to advocate for the causes of the Muslim minorities in the world. Afterwards, we have another commenter. He's not with us yet, but he will join us shortly. Dr.Hadi al-Zara. He will comment on the papers, and he is a graduate from Tehran University with the specialization in the Middle East studies, and he has a number of books on the Islamic movements, especially in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and the Salafi jihadi movements in the different geographies in the world, and the future or the political future of the Shia political movements after ISIS and other times. Welcome all, and thank you for responding for our invitation and participating in this important symposium. As you know, Iraq is one of the most important countries in the Arab and Muslim world in history and in the ancient history and the modern history as well. Mr. Ibrahim Al-Abadi will start with his presentation on his paper about the political Islam in Iraq after the 1990s. You will have 20 minutes. Please unmute yourself and start speaking, please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. تسمعونني الآن؟
Peace be upon you. Do you hear me now? In the name of God, the most merciful, the most bountiful, and all praise be to God the Almighty, and all the blessings and the prayers be upon His Messenger Muhammad. In the beginning, I would like to thank Dr.Sami Alarian for this kind invitation. And I would like also to express my gratitude to Sabah Din Zaim University and the education staff in the university and the other speakers who are meeting today to discuss an important issue, which is the political Islam movements in the Arab and Muslim regions, and for me to speak in this session that is dedicated for Iraq. I believe that the political history of Iraq cannot be simplified and detailed without dedicating a significant part of it to the Islamic movement. Since the 1950s, the Islamic movement in Iraq have become part of the political history of Iraq. The main understanding for the Islamic movements in the Muslim world is to bring back governance for Islam in the Islamic realm. I started with my paper that the concern of Muslims in general, the concern of the Islamic movements in general is that they want to achieve this purpose, to bring back governance to Islam in the realm of Muslims with the Islamic values, Islamic morals, Islamic laws be implemented. All of the Islamic movements and Islamic communities are coming from their understanding and their perception of Islam and their understanding of the monolithic religion of Islam. This is something that is uncontested or not controversy. So all the activism in Islamic movement is aiming to achieve that purpose. So when I say that I want to look into the Islamic movements after 90 years of activism, especially that we are looking at the mother political movement or the first movement that started to happen, which is the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920 or 1930. So we are talking about a lot of controversy, conflict, struggle, and violent struggle as well that led to armed conflict, unfortunately, in the recent times. So these stepping stones, when we take them into consideration and look at the current time, the present time, and look what have been achieved by the Islamic movements, what have been fulfilled, where they were right, where they were wrong, and why. We had a problem in a general problem in all of the Islamic movements that in the beginning they rejected to have any revision or critique to their principles and their the main visions for the society. Now, after some Islamic movements where I had the opportunity to participate in governance or to get to the top of governance or to lose governance after they got there. Now, we have an opportunity to look at these Islamic movements and try to point to the problems that they suffered from or that they put themselves in. We should not talk about a Puritan status and blaming everything on the enemies and the general audience or in the Islamic community. They are reactionary. They are only receivers of what is happening in the world, and they are not taking initiative. So this interaction and this dynamics led the Islamic movement to accumulate a lot of efforts and a lot of understanding. It got them also into a lot of struggle and a lot of problems. So to make a long story short, I will be focusing on the Islamic movements in Iraq. And when I say that the Islamic movement suffered from a lot of problems, I mean about half a century of political activity in Iraq or political action that was in most secret work. And here I'm talking about the Islamic movements that belong to the Shia school of thought. Most of the Sunni movements were open. They were able to work without a lot of constraints. However, they faced some problems, and they had to call themselves or to give themselves other names. The Islamic movement, for example, was established in 1960 and it was licensed. But in general, the partisan Islamic movements, the modern one in Iraq, they suffered from the problem of constraints, secrecy, and inability to have access to the community openly through open platforms, using the media outlets, and to have political agenda that is clear and open. This led that this movement was limited to the elites. They were targeting only the elites, university students, some social classes that will allow the understanding of the vision of these Islamic movements. The Iraqi or the reliance of the Iraqi Islamic movements on the elite led them in the end that they lost a wide popular support, or to lose the grassroots so that can be the depth of those movements. The Islamic movement claims that it represents the largest majority of the Iraqi community, and that the Islamic movement wants to achieve what the constituency or the popular or the grassroots wanted to achieve. And later we discovered that the Islamic movement in Iraq was an elitist movement, unable to access the lower grassroots or the wider audience. This caused the Islamic movement to lose the protection net that it has, which means having a constituency that is understanding and interacting with the Islamic movement. This made the Islamic movement lose a constituency that could have supported the Islamic movement in the crisis. Because of the pressure, the prosecution that was practiced against the Islamic movement, so they started to work from abroad, and this movement outside Iraq was costly because the constituency that was inside Iraq, they were prosecuted, destroyed, and fragmented. But abroad, the Islamic movement is living outside its audience and outside its constituency. They are unable to communicate with their audience inside Iraq. They are relying on some of the constituency that belong to it outside Iraq. So how can this Islamic movement that is forbidden from communicating with its constituency inside Iraq to be effective and present in the social and political levels or fields inside Iraq? That was a very major problem, which led the Islamic movement to consume a lot of time since the 1970s until change that took place in 2003. The movement was working away from its constituency. The pressure they had outside Iraq, the pressure from alienation, and the difficult conditions they lived in diaspora led to the lack of the organized work, the severance of their relations with their constituency, and in its turn, that led to the lack of coordination and communication with their constituency. It was linear relations and with very small groups of people. So that led to a frozen mentality and inability to save the country or rescue the country from the prosecution of authority. And later, just as happened in what happened in Iraq with its peculiarity, rescuing the homeland became the main problem. Iraq was under severe sanctions, and it was living in a very uncomfortable social conditions. And the state terror and the sanctions that were implemented, the doubts that was dominating relations inside Iraq. All of that led that the Islamic movements, both Sunni and Shia, were unable to unify the Islamic work or the Islamic activity because of the skepticism that they have against each other and the differences they have. Maybe some people were thinking that saving Iraq should be the priority, and we should not think about the governance and what shape of governance and what is the constitution that we need to adopt. This also led to several other problems. Amongst the problems of the Islamic movement in Iraq, the Islamic movements in Iraq managed to make or to build some relations with other movements, if we want non-Muslim one, if we want to call them, for example, secular, leftists, for example, the communist, democratic or liberal groups, the nationalistic, or other movements. However, all of these efforts failed to come out with a political program that is agreed upon, that can rescue the country from the major crises it was going through. That's why when the American occupation came in 2003, the Islamic movement came back to the homeland. This homeland, when it came back, it didn't find its constituency. This movement is seen as part of the political conflict that destroyed the country, and it is seen that it was unable to communicate with the community inside Iraq, and they were unable to understand the reality of the problems people are suffering from. When the Islamic movements participated in the first governance after the occupation, after 2003, another problem appeared, which is how can these Islamic movements can participate in a political formula that was that came and crystallized under occupation, and the Islamic movement went into a problem with some of the grassroots and on the left and the right, that to be in part of the council of governance or the governing council costed a lot of its reputation and in its programs later. How was that? The state was destroyed. The state was non-existent anymore. So the program of rebuilding the state was a priority. But how and in what shapes and what conditions? The program that the Islamic movement used to speak about, is it going to work with the higher purposes of the Islam, for example, the higher purposes of jurisprudence or the creed or aqidah, or on what grounds? So, because we are backward communities and we have missed a lot of the development and modernity, so we need to start anew. This was also another problem added to the different layers of problems that the Islamic movements suffered from. When we lose the constituency and when the movement is only an elitist movement and it is unable to agree with other Islamic movements that are working in the same atmosphere, and when we can't have a unified program, and when it works on its own as a political movement, and when it wants to build a new program, a political program. So this all led to the failure of the Islamic movement in Iraq. So the Islamic movements in Iraq, Sunni and Shia, were unable to find solutions for their problems, and they were unable to provide the practical solutions for the problems of the country. So when they start to participate in finding solutions, their participation in governance and being a part of the power was built on experience and error, a trial and error. So there was a civil conflict because of the problems that or the situation that we had in Iraq, and the struggle for power, as well as the foreign intervention and the conflicting interests of countries, neighboring Iraq and the United States. The polarization also that happened in Iraq for the interests of neighboring countries of Iraq, it made Iraq a place of conflict where different agendas were conflicting and people are taking sides of these different agendas. And the Islamic movement found itself living a clientele relation with the audience, which means the movement will provide services for its audience in order to get their political support. And because of the conditions that we have in Iraq, the conditions of occupation, the poor socio-economic conditions, the conditions of terrorism, the harsh intervention, the community was living severe political backwardness. All of that caused the Islamic movement to face a heavy failure that have eaten its reputation and its support. Although the Iraqi community is a conservative and religious community, and it is more religious in a communal way or in the ritualistic way. So the Islamic movement was able to reproduce itself in Iraq in a short time, taking into consideration that the non-religious movements in Iraq, the liberal and secular movements, although they have long history in Iraq, but they don't have popular background. And the Islamic movement was facing or trying to solve problems in socio-economic services and political way. The Islamic movement was unable to bring together the different parties and was unable to bring together the Islamic national groups. The political struggle was very severe, and the Islamic movement in Iraq couldn't preserve the a threshold of the historic mass that can be protective of the national unity. So it became a factor of division and a factor of conflict. All of that was the history and the atmosphere in Iraq. Can we say, according to that we have a structural problem, a structure in the thought, a structure in the discourse, or in practice? In my own opinion, I would say that the problem is in all of these aspects, in the structure and organization, in the discourse, and in the inability of the Islamic movements to renew itself, renew its vision, and to solve the problems realistically. The Islamic movements will not disappear from the Iraqi reality. They will stay there, and they will have their own audience. However, right now, they are incurred or with heavy failure. Some people can say that we cannot judge the Islamic movement in 20 years of practice and participation in power. This is a short time, or it is too short to judge them. We need more time. But personally speaking, I would say that the Islamic movement is burdened with a lot of problems and mistakes. Some of them are subjective, some others are objective that are out of their control. But in conclusion, the Islamic movement is not living a condition that is appropriate or useful for Iraq. They are now accused, and so they need to renew themselves, to criticize itself, and to dot the I's and to cross the T's with a self-critique before it is being criticized from outside very sharply, which might destroy what is left of its political and religious legitimacy that is left for it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Abadi. Mr. Ibrahim, in the beginning of his paper, said that the Islamic movements represent part and parcel of the society and people go back to Islam, and he wants to that to be the beginning of unifying of people. And after 90 years of the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1929, there was a lot of conflict and the struggle, but the question is what has been achieved of this of their purposes, where they did right, where they did wrong. He's tried to answer this question. He says that a lot of movements refuse to criticize or revise their vision or their mistakes, but after they became part of the governance, we have an opportunity to provide a criticism of their experience. He says that the Shia movement in Iraq consumed itself with secrecy before the occupation, of course, or the invasion of the United States. So the Islamic movement suffered from that a lot, and it was unable to work openly because of security measures. That led for that movement to be elitist movement and unable to have access to the society, and that led to lose the constituency that would be the protection net for it, although it claims that it represents different social groups. However, it remained an elitist group, unable to reach the society and to be provided with the protection that is provided by the constituency and the people. When the oppression and prosecution became very heavy, they had to go out and work outside Iraq. That led to a frozen thought and unable to know the problems in Iraq, and they suffered from different groups, especially under the sanctions that Iraq came under. Also, the Islamic movement were unable to unify the Islamic narrative or discourse, especially with the skepticism that was between the different schools of thought. And at sometimes it communicated with the liberal and communist and secular movements, but it was unable to make any achievements or to have any unified agenda. After the American invasion, it came back to the homeland, but it lost all of its constituency. It participated in the governance, and when it participated in governance, it was under occupation. Getting into this political history, it costed it in its reputation. The state was destroyed, institutions were destroyed. So the Islamic movements at that time wanted to get into governance according to the Sharia and modernity, but that was unable because the movement lacked the constituency and the popular support, and it was unable to make other Islamic movements to work together, and it didn't have Islamic project, and it was relying on services. The Shia Sunni unification failed, and it was unable to provide anything for society, and they were trying the governance according to trial and error. So we see different agendas. The Islamic movement was living a client service provider relationship with the people, and because of the different problems like terrorism, the intervention of regional and international powers, and all other problems led to the failure of the Islamic movement that has eaten its reputation and its legitimacy. If we look at the Islamic movement, we can see that, or we can ask, can it be rebuild itself or not? Whereas the secular movements that are more complicated, they don't have popular support because the society is conservative, so they were able to rebuild themselves within the community. However, they failed to build the Islamic group or the a unified agenda for the country, and the there were a lot of problems in society. This is the negative aspect of the Islamic movement. Then he asked question, where is the problem? Is it in the structure, in the organization, in the thoughts, or in the discourse? His answer to this is that in all of these aspects, the inability to renew itself and to solve the problems in a way that is appropriate, the Islamic movement will not disappear. They will continue to be there, but it is burdened with failure. Some people might say that it is too early to judge the Islamic movement. However, it is a very important point, because there are a lot of problems. Some are subjective, some others are objective, and now it is not living in a good condition. It is accused, or it is a defendant, so it should renew its discourse before it is too late, in order to bring back what remains of its legitimacy amongst the society. Thank you very much. And now we move to the intervention of Dr. Saad Kubaisi. The floor is yours.
Peace be upon you all. I would like to thank CIGA and Dr. Sami Alarian for hosting this symposium, and I would like to greet all the dear speakers, Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Othman, and Dr. Anas on this very interesting topic, which is quite rich and significant, but I'm going to focus on the general outline, so to speak, given that given the time limits. Actually, my paper talks about the Sunni Islamic movement in Iraq, the lessons learned and future prospects, and I used the Islamic Iraqi Party as a case study or a model. And undoubtedly, the state of Iraq, examining the situation in Iraq, requires particular scrutiny and meticulousness in details and verification, given the complexity and ramification of the situation, which reflects on every aspect, including the Sunni community and the Islamic Iraqi Party, which operates in this community. So it is no exaggeration to say that studying the Sunni situation in Iraq may be the most complicated in terms of its components or its interactive factors in this Iraqi Islamic Party, which is going to be our case study, which is a political party and a political actor that has its successes and failures, but it was unique in both ways for the factors that I'm going to explore. And in this context, I divided my paper on three main topics. The first was about the historical evolution of the Iraqi Islamic Party, very briefly. And the second is the heart or the core of this paper, which is an analytical view of the practice and ideology of this party. And the third part would be about the conclusions and future prospects. Actually, we could talk about the historical evolution of the Iraqi Islamic Party on three levels. So the first was the foundational period, as the Islamic movement in Iraq started in the mid-1940s under the monarchy with the establishment of the Iraqi state, and it ended with 1958. And they were affected, the Islamic movement was affected as other Islamic movements in the Islamic and Arab world with the bitterness and the aftermath of the CIGA agreement and the sense of injustice of their situation. And Dr. Muhammad Mahmoud al-Sawaf was a particularly charismatic figure who was the founder of the Islamic movement in Iraq, and he was an extension, and which was an extension of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, as he was blessed by Sheikh Hassan al-Banna at the time, and he was joined by a number of young people who were aspiring for an Islamic model that is institutional or institutionalized and alive and vigorous. So it reflects the concerns of that period of time, and he had a number of scholars along his side, and he was supported by them, particularly Mr. Sheikh Amjad al-Zahawi, who gave him much legitimacy. Under the monarchy, the Islamic movement worked quite freely with a few disagreements, as the Islamic movement regarded the new statehood situation as an extension of the CIGA agreement, as the colonization and occupation. And as soon as the republic was established, they decided to establish the Islamic Party, which was an advanced move, particularly that this was blessed even by Shia scholars and points of reference, as the Shia arena was quite poor in terms of the presence of an Islamic movement at all. And given that they had the mutual rivals, given be it the Communist Party or Al-Ba'ath Party, who were against the Islamic movement at large, they joined ranks. But then Mr. Abdullah Karim Qasim shut down this party, and Mr. Zaidan took over the leadership of the Islamic movement until the coup of Al-Ba'ath Party. After Al-Ba'ath Party took power in 1968, we had mainly 5 parties that were rivals to Al-Ba'ath: the nationalists, the Muslim Brotherhood, the army, and the Kurdish parties in the north. So the Nasserite nationalists, after the June 1967, were not as strong, particularly with the monopoly of power by Al-Ba'ath party. And as for the communists, they constituted a big challenge because of the strong literature, and they had to, Al-Ba'ath Party had to try to contain it and then dismantle it. As for the army, it was completely under the control of Al-Ba'ath Party, except for a few pockets that were liquidated at the end, because the coup was staged by senior officers in the army. As for the Kurdish, despite the March agreement, which gave autonomy for the 3 Kurdish governorates in the north, the Kurds continued their rebellion. As for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the case in point, Mr. Zaidan realized the magnitude of the challenge under the Ba'ath Party rule, so much so that many were exiled, and he closed down the party and it started its secret operation. With the third phase under the occupation, the movement represented by the Iraqi Islamic Party, which, as I said, became more active in the 1990s, started to integrate or participate in the new political operation using the jurisprudence of being forced or coercion, having to deal with the status quo. So despite their refusal of occupation. They had to operate under the new situation after the obliteration of the state through the occupation. They had to try to re-establish the state by operating within that new political system, and with the defendant seat given to the Sunnis being held to account to all the mistakes of previous administrations or regimes. Nonetheless, despite all the problems, the Muslim Brotherhood remained the greatest or the biggest representative of the Sunnis in Iraq until they totally lost in the recent elections at the end of 2021, when Al-Adl or Justice and Ihsan in Iraq, or which are the Brotherhood, received no seats in the parliament. So this is, in very briefly, the history of the Islamic movement in Iraq. To move to the analytical view of this experience in terms of ideology and practice, the first aspect I would like to start with, talking about the performance and the ideology of the the Iraqi Islamic Party. It's important to take into consideration the specificity of Iraq, the diversity and the multiplicity of components ethnically and religiously, and more or less it is a largely conservative country with tribal attitude as well. And there were many things that were not understood in Iraq when the Americans occupied Iraq, given the number of sects, the geographical considerations, the historical considerations, and the intertwining of all of those factors. And this lack of understanding was taken advantage of by international as well as local actors who wanted to use this country as a stage for their legitimate and illegitimate demands. So there are so many dichotomies in Iraq that have to be taken into consideration. For example, the Iraqi situation is one of the most complicated in the contemporary era. At the same time, it's one of the most largely understood from within and without. So any superficial or partial consideration of actors in the Iraqi arena caused many mistakes that were predictable or unpredictable, or sometimes even fatal, when they thought there was only the binary or the dichotomy of resistance and occupation. But actually there were many other actors and dichotomies that have their influence in the Iraqi arena. For example, resistance versus opposition, versus occupation, Shia versus Sunni, Iraq and Kuwait, Iraq and Syria, dictatorship versus democracy, Iraq versus Iran, openness versus introversion, is Islamism versus secularism. All of those dichotomies only indicate how complicated the situation in Iraq, which only indicates how innovative and multifaceted any solutions should be. And actually, the faulty approaches have many reasons, or can be attributed to many reasons that I mentioned in my paper, that go beyond the scope of my time limit right now. But what can be said for the credit of the Islamic movement, which developed and evolved within that context and within that complexity, actually it was, for its credit, it was the one party that most provided initiatives to accommodate for that diversity and inclusiveness. But the problem was in terms of practice and performance, and that party was not able to meet or to walk the talk, so to speak. So they were able to deal very professionally with certain dichotomies like Arabs versus Kurds, occupation versus the resistance, but they failed with other dichotomies, for example, Iraq versus Iran and Islamism versus secularism. So much of that confusion was because of the literature, ideological literature that they inherited without adaptation, although they were flexible in terms of their decision and practice. But their ideological literature, for example, would not allow them to participate in the political process under occupation, but they did so. But at the same time, they were a bit rigid in dealing with the nature of the Sunni community, as they focused on particular strata more than others. The other issue is the issue of elitism, which Dr. Ibrahim mentioned in general terms. The Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic movement were known for being elitist in their attitude and in their membership. So they were mainly university graduates, doctors and engineers, etc., which made them sort of in conflict internally with between their ideological and academic work and their popular and public affair work. And despite the change in practice of that party, it remained at heart an elitist party, and that's no wonder given that the Muslim Brotherhood remained working in secret for decades. The party also succeeded at many levels in addressing the rank and file of the Muslim or the Sunni community with the imbalance of the nascent state and the injustice that was inflicted upon the Sunni community. But the problem of the party was that it was an elite that took over the mandate of protecting and standing up for the Sunni community without real mandate by the people. For 3 years, it was only Mr. Saleh Al-Mutlaq was there, and they took major decisions such as accepting or approving the constitution, provided that it will be amended, or approving the security agreement in 2006. And regardless whether those decisions were right or wrong, those decisions would have needed the public support that was not available from the people, although they thought they had it because of the majority vote they received in the legislative council. The other issue is the ideology, because at the end of the day, this is an Islamic party and some of its literature is non-negotiable. So they rejected the American occupation not only on nationalistic ground but also on religious grounds. And here I would like to highlight two quick points: that the party found itself within the context of political work and expression of the Sunni community. They found that this community requires services and demands and security that go beyond the ideology, and that was a mandate beyond the capacity of this party, and it stood helpless, although it tried to achieve some. The other issue is that it was held captive to its theory of change and reform, and it didn't have an accurate reading of the nature of the Sunni Iraqi community that is tribal and conservative. So, for example, the Shia parties, they started with their access to the community through the Shia sense of injustice. The Kurds used their sense of injustice as well, but the Sunnis had a sense of exclusion. But all of this was put in a purely Islamic light that was not adapted to the current situation of the living conditions of the people at the time being. The fourth point, and I realize that
وأن العمل مع أن الإسلام دين ودولة وأن العمل السياسي هو جوهر عمل
didn't realize that or didn't recognize that the work was religion and state, and they failed sometimes to account for the complexity of the Iraqi context. And there are a number of reasons that Shia and Kurdish parties before the occupation practiced opposition, political practice in the opposition ranks before the occupation, and this wasn't available for the Islamic Party. The fifth was the independence. The Islamic Party is completely independent in its literature and ideology and practice, so it has no extension outside. But was this a strength or a weakness? Of course, independence is positive, but with the lack of alliances, that's really a problem, given the alliances of the Kurdish and Shia parties, which turned out to be very essential in the Iraqi context, leaving the Sunni Islamic movement without any alliances or external support. Another issue is that the party, like any political there was a peculiarity that's similar to many other political parties, which is that it was associated with its with the Muslim Brotherhood and was linked to their Shura Council, but there were some dissent, like Tariq al-Hashimi, who started a new movement in 2011. Also, we had a dissociation with the authorities, and then the party was completely dissociated and or separated. And in 2016, we had a group of the party that also separated and went back to the Muslim Brotherhood themselves. So organizationally, the party suffered multiple blows. Also, in terms of ideology, the Iraqi Islamic Party suffered some problems with the development of its ideology and literature, particularly in terms of details, in terms of its political practice. Of course, there were some developments, but they were not a comprehensive overhaul. The other aspect is violence and resistance. When we talk about Iraq, we talk about much violence that erupts and continues, but the party rejected all forms of violence, and it was credible for that reason, particularly that it had no armed militias, but at the same time it suffered a very challenging formula, because within the political operation it had to incriminate and condemn the resistance, which is rejected by the political process. At the same time, it was pressured by its constituency to support resistance, and the party actually tried to strike a balance, and it succeeded and failed at certain instances. And there are also the civilian or civil aspects. At the end of the day, this party was a civil aspect, but in the situation of Iraq, this makes it exposed in a largely armed context in Iraq. So, but it highlighted its civil nature, and it suffered for that stance by losing many of its leaders who were civil leaders who were liquidated. Finally, my conclusions, I believe this party had to deal with the specificity of Iraq and the complexity of the situation in Iraq, but did not have the strategic sponsorship and understanding of this diversity and peculiarity. And although it tried to dissociate itself from elitism, but it remains very much elitist, and it stood out for independence, as we said, but it lacked alliance or allies and external and internal backing, and it also struck a relative balance between using or engaging in the political process and also appeasing its constituency, and it suffered a lot of blows, particularly the liquidation and descent of some of its leaders and figures. And to conclude, in terms of future prospects, it is necessary to reformulate local literature for the Islamic movement that take into consideration the peculiarity of Iraq, and the public work has to be, and the popular work has to be expanded in order to avoid elitism and to understand and or fine-tune the Sunni Islamic discourse, and to focus on political awareness programs, and also to combine the fine-tuning with internal affairs as well as external backing, and contacting and joining the ranks of other parties with joint demands, not necessarily internationalizing those demands, and also to fine-tune their institutions to be suitable for the context, and also to continue to work in the political arena while focusing on the civil nature of this party. The party has to be careful not to go into any area that would threaten it in security terms. And finally, the experience of the Islamic movement in Iraq reflects the experience of the Sunni movement in Iraq, of an ideological movement in a non-ideologized environment, and a civil movement within an armed context. And those are very important aspects that scholars have to take into consideration. So studying the Sunni experience may be even richer than that of the Shia and Kurdish experiences, because they are clearer in terms of their practice and literature, because the experience of the Sunni movement in Iraq was rather complicated. Thank you so much, Dr. Saad. Dr. Saad talked about the experience of the Sunni Islamic movement, and he used the Iraqi Islamic Party as a party, and he said that we needed to understand the aspects of the Iraqi experience, and that the Sunni Islamic experience may be the most complicated of all, but it's also unique in terms of its successes and weaknesses. And he talked about three aspects. First, the historical evolution, and second, an analytical analysis of practice and ideology, and third, future prospects. In the evolution, he talked about the foundation from the 1940s under the monarchy until the coup of Abdul Karim Qasim in 1958, and he talked about the founder of this movement, who is Sheikh Al-Sawaf, who was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and that the movement worked rather freely, but then it established the Islamic Party in 1961, and it was an advanced party at the time. For example, the Shia did not have political parties, and it was a chance to work against the rivals, the Baathists, nationalists, and leftists. And then we had the coup of Al-Ba'ath Party, and we had the nationalist Nasrites, Nasseris, and the Communist Party, and the army, which was controlled by Al-Ba'ath Party, and the Kurds. As for the Muslim Brotherhood, they froze their activity in Iraq until they came back to action in 1990s, and the third phase was after the occupation, in which they engaged in the political process despite their rejection for the occupation, and they tried to re-establish the state. And there were many challenges, including the rise of the Salafi movement within the Sunni ranks, and the Islamic movement was the most important representative of the Sunnis despite the failure in elections. And then he talked about an analytical view about their practice and literature, and he said that the peculiarity of Iraq is that it has multiple components in terms of ethnicities, national and sects, and that Iraq was the stage for many national and international actors. And he said that there were many dichotomies that many failed to understand in order to understand the situation in Iraq, because the situation in Iraq is quite complicated, and the superficial reading of the situation in Iraq caused many problems. He mentioned those dichotomies, including occupation versus resistance, Arabs versus Kurds, resistance versus terrorism, state versus non-state, etc. And this is a complicated situation that necessitates complicated or complex solutions. And it is in that context that the Islamic movement was operating or came forward, but they worked well, and they used their literature, but the failures were in practice, and some of their literature was restricting, and sometimes they were rigid in their understanding of the literature. And also there was the elitism, which caused the party to be captive to its ideology. And he says that it's captive to that ideology because of the secret operation during the past decades. So it represents the Sunni community, but its problem was to be able to take up the responsibility with by delegation or mandate from its constituency. And also the other issue was the ideology, that it was a religious party, but it found itself facing some service-based demands beyond ideological demands, and to remain helpless or unable to address those demands or needs. And another problem was that the Shia parties were based on the injustice against Shia, the Kurds was based against the injustice against Kurds, while the Sunnis used the idea of exclusion, and they were unable to introduce themselves properly. But the Shia and Kurds also practiced politics within and without Iraq in a more complicated manner than the Sunnis. And the Sunnis were independent, or the Sunni movement was independent, but this was also a weakness because they failed to have any external allies, and they received number of blows in organizational terms and weaknesses, and it reflected directly on the work of the party and its activeness. So it remained linked only to ideology or literature more than to practice, and it maintained its stance in refusing violence, particularly that it didn't have any armed militias, but They suffered the double pressure from the political context that incriminated the resistance versus the constituency which supported the resistance. The conclusion that he reached, Dr. Saad said that this experience indicates that this party was able to address the peculiarity of Iraq and interacted with the complex situation in Iraq without the strategic extension, and that elitism was a characteristic of this party. They tried to overcome it, but their literature and their nature remained elitist, and it tried to combine the literature and the practice, and they failed and succeeded, and they suffered with problems of lack of political awareness and lack of communication skills in terms of addressing its own constituencies, and it suffered lack of alliance or allies. The organizational cohesion was not so strong, whether from within or with the other movements, so it affected their activity, but they succeeded in using the popular resistance discourse, and a number of leaders, however, quit the party. But in terms of future prospects, he said that it is important to fine-tune the literature and the discourse to the local context, and to expand political awareness, and to understand the conservative rather than ideologized Sunni constituency, and to look for common denominators with all parties, including with issues related to human rights and freedoms, for example, and also to consolidate its organizational cohesion, and also to maintain its civil nature, but avoid any situations in which it risks its security. He concluded saying that this experience is the experience of the Sunni political work in through a religious party that's ideological within a non-religious or non-ideologized context, and that this experience may be richer and more complicated than the Kurdish and Shia parties. Thank you, Dr. Saad. Now we move to Dr. Othman Ali. He was going to talk about the Islamic movement in Kurdistan.
دكتور عثمان تسمعني؟
Dr. Osman, do you hear me?
دكتور عثمان لا أعلم إذا كان معنا.
تليفون دكتور، رن عليه التليفون.
دكتور عثمان
الله يعين الدكتور عثمان، مرهق الله يعينه.
لأنه هو الآن هو في كندا
أي
الساعة الآن 3 صباحا. تفضل دكتور عثمان. نعم.
عفوا أنا حاضر.
إحنا مقدرين جدا. أنا كنت ما أعرف إنك أنت في كندا، فمقدر جدا يعني.
لا ولا يهمك.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your presence. You are in Canada and it is too late. It's 3 a.m. in Canada. So we appreciate your presence with us.
أشكركم أستاذ دكتور سامي، وأشكر معادكم والجامعة.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, and I would like to thank the university for inviting me, and I would like to thank this.
سبقتني ولو مع الأسف أنا أطلب.
I would like to thank the speakers because I benefited benefited from the papers before me, and I would like to apologize because it's around 4 a.m. in where I am now. But I will try in my paper, which is part of a book that I am writing and preparing to be published. The book is about the the present and the future of the Kurdistan Islamic movement in Iraq. The paper that I am writing, I am trying to discuss the discourse mechanisms and the challenges. And by challenges, I am talking about the subjective and objective conditions reaching or discussing the internal and external aspects, and how all of that impacted the Islamic current in Kurdistan and the Islamic movement in Kurdistan right now, and where is it heading in the future. Now, before I get into the topic, I would like to discuss very briefly a historic background of the Islamic activity in Kurdistan. The Islamic activity, and here I mean the political activity in Kurdistan, has its roots back to the 19th century, where the scholars of Kurdistan and the sheikhs of the mystic or Sufi methodologies were present very highly in the Kurdistan movements, because they were, for example, movements against the Al-Ittihad wa-Taraqi, or the unity and the development, the Turkish one, or from the Ottoman time. They moved against it, and they, for example, the Qadimiyya methodology, which is one of the strongest methodologies of the Sufi movement. These movements, or these Sufi movements, were mobilizing the people or the audience against the unity and development movement, the Ottoman one. Those in the Kurdish society, they are led by religious leaders, by the Sufi religious leaders. So when I studied these movements, I found that they have two goals. First, defending the grievances of the Kurds and defending the Islamic Sharia. For example, the movement of Sheikh Said against Mustafa Kemal. This movement, of course, Sheikh Said was the leader of the Naqshbandi Sufi methodology. Mustafa Kemal started with the policy of forcibly merging the Kurds, and of course, you all know he removed the Sharia laws. So Sheikh Said started to lead a movement, and that movement was demanding, on one hand, it was calling for the rights of the people of Kurdistan, and on another hand, it was calling for defending the Islamic Sharia. There is a U.S. writer, his name is Robert Olson. He came to Turkey and he studied the movement from the archives of the Turkish state, and he found out that had the movement of Sheikh Said succeeded, it would have established Kurdish caliphate in the region. So this is the background, which is defending the Kurds, and the Islamic movement is not a strange movement, or that is coming from Western ideology or Western support. No, this is a historic movement within the Kurdish society. Now, to talk about the presence of the Kurdish movement, very briefly as well, the work of the Muslim Brotherhood in Kurdistan. The work of the Muslim Brotherhood in Kurdistan was very weak. There were individuals or religious leaders in the beginning of the Sunni Islamic activity, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. So they were influenced with it. But we found that the Islamic current in the beginning, it was weak in the Kurdish area for different reasons. One of the reasons, maybe in my opinion, is that the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, it was a nationalistic Arabist current that considered any attention to the Kurdish matters at the time was not necessary, and even the literature, their literature was talking about the grievances of the Kurds or the rights of the Kurds as a movement that will divide the Ummah, and that is a movement that doesn't belong to the Muslim the religious agenda. And they always used to say that when you implement Islam, you will not speak about Kurds or other ethnicities. So that was the literature of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's why it didn't appeal to the Kurdish people. However, on the other side, after the World War I, the secular nationalistic movement was very appealing. So when the English were in Iraq, they supported the nationalistic movements, as well as the French in Syria, for example. Under the French mandate, they supported the nationalistic Kurdish current. So the Islamic Kurdish current in the beginning was very weak, and the Kurdish nationalists from the nationalist current was more prevailing in Kurdistan. Now we speak about another current, which is in 1987, we started to see a jihadi scholarly movement that is affected by the jihadi literature of the jihadi groups in Afghanistan and in Iran. And in the beginning, it called itself the Islamic Association of Kurdistan. And then in 1988, this movement turned to become the Islamic movement in Kurdistan under Sheikh Mullah Othman Abdulaziz. So this is the history of the Islamic movement. Then around the year 2000, and after the death of Sheikh Othman, this movement, there were defections within the movement, and there was Koma under Sheikh Ali Bakir. And in 2003, from the Islamic movement, there was another division that became a jihadi Salafi movement that called itself Ansar al-Islam, and it was influenced by Al-Qaeda. That was the jihadi aspect of the movement. But in 1994, it seemed that there was an understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq that they should have influence amongst the Kurds, and that they should to allow building an organization, and that's why there was a party called the Yakutu in Kurdish, which is part of it. In its principles is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it adopts the Kurdish rights, and this Yakutu, which is the Islamic Union, started recently to call for, or after a few years, start to call for the independence of Kurdistan and the self-determination of Kurdistan. This is the history of the Islamic movement, but now I will try to speak about the future of the Islamic movement. I believe that the future of the Islamic current or the Islamic movement in Kurdistan is not promising a lot of success. The Islamic movement in Kurdistan is marginalized, or it works on the margins, and we can say it is even isolated from the Kurdistani sphere. It has no influence, and there are reasons for that. Part of these reasons are things that are related from within the Islamic movement, because there are some problems with the Islamic movement. Just as Dr. Ibrahim Al-Abadi said that the Islamic movement in Iraq, it was an elitist in its parts, and the same applies to the Islamic movement in Kurdistan. And the discourse of the Islamic movement is also elitist in its work and in its activity, and it doesn't have the power to take initiatives. So, for example, if we look at the most recent results of elections that took place in 2021 in Iraq, in the Kurdish area, or in the Kurdish region, there is shrinking of the Islamic movement in the Kurdish region, and they lost the votes they used to have. And in the recent elections in the parliament, there was another current that, as was under the name the New Zeal Party. It has won 11 seats, whereas the Islamic movement in Kurdistan won only 5 seats, which means that the Islamic current or the Islamic movement in Kurdistan is shrinking, and it is not strong. And as I said, one of the reasons is the elitist nature of the party or the movement. Some other reasons are out of control of the Islamic movement in Kurdistan, Iraq, which is, for example, the lack of an international environment that supports the Islamic movement in Kurdistan, Iraq. For example, the nationalist movement of Kurdistan is always supported by one regional or another regional power. But the Islamic movement in Iraq is constrained by the secular movements that have all the strength in media, or the money that is provided for them, and political support that they receive from foreign powers, whereas the Islamic movements are constrained. After the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the Islamic movement could have benefited from the Islamic Revolution in Iran, just like Hamas did. But the Islamic movement in Kurdistan, because it is a new current, or was a new current, and wasn't mature politically, so part of them, but part of the members used to go to Saudi Arabia or other areas asking for support because they were telling them that you need to support us because we are against the Rafidi school of thoughts in Iraq. And of course, those messages, of course, used to be recorded, and it arrived to the Islamic revolution in Iran. So the Iranian revolution considered this movement a Wahhabi movement, and so they will had never support them. And they didn't benefit neither in the past nor now
Sheikh
from
Ali,
their relation with Turkey, especially the AK party in Turkey. So Ali Bakir, who is a member of the Komil, or the Justice Islamic Justice Kurdish party, he's heading that party. Sheikh Ali Bakir says in his statements about a year ago, he said that I reject to call the PKK a terrorist organization because it is fighting and struggling for the Kurdish rights. So the Turkish government knows that, therefore, it doesn't support the movement. And even our brothers in the Islamic movement, which belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood. I had some relation with Ahmad Dawoodoglu because we were together in the Universal Islamic University, and several times the brothers of the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Muslim Association, they used to ask Mr. Ahmad, can you help us to start some relations? So I used to tell them, you as a party, you should have relations with the AK party or the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. One of their leaders, who is member of the political office, he came to Istanbul, and this is just an example to clarify about he came to the strategic thinking conference that was held in Istanbul 4 years ago. Karwani, who is one of the leaders of the most Islamic Union, he said that we call in the name of Islam for the liberation of the grand Kurdistan, including parts of Turkey. Of course, this is rejected by the state in Turkey and the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. That's why they are dealing with the movements in Kurdistan as a state. That's why they would rather deal with the Barzani rather than dealing with the Islamic Union. And the same they dealt with Talibani rather than dealing with the Islamic current, which they consider, or sorry, Iran was dealing with Talibani because they consider the Islamic movement a Wahhabi movement. So these are some of the crises of the Islamic movement, and as part, it is part of the crises that the international Islamic movements suffer from, that they are seen as terrorist groups, extremist groups. That's why the Islamic movements, they are always under the threat of being called terrorists. That's why the left or the liberal objection against the government of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, they were brave because, for example, there is tyranny, there is corruption, and there is mismanagement. But the Islamists in Kurdistan are afraid to confront these points because they lack a proper management in Kurdistan. In addition to that, there is another factor, which is the foreign or the Western factor, because as you know, Kurdistan is considered by the United States and Israel a backyard. Here, I don't want to add what the Arab audience know that is Kurdistan is like another Israel. That's not correct because we are Kurds living on our territories. We are not building settlements. We have been living in this area before the Arabs. This is our land, and we are calling for our own rights. But because of historic conditions, the Kurdish leadership became related to the United States and Israel. So the Israelis and the United States are monitoring everything in Kurdistan region of Iraq. So that's another factor that prevents us from that prevents the Islamic movement from working. Another factor for the backwardness of the Islamic movement activity in Kurdistan is the lack of separation between dawah and the political activity. I believe this is part of the problems of Islamic movements even outside the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I believe it is time for the political work to move on the parameters of the political struggle, taking into consideration all the activities and the matters that are related to politics and separated from the dawah. So it is very important to separate the dawah activity from the political activity of the movement. I spoke with the brothers in the Islamic current, those from Komal and Yagutu groups, and they said, no, our constituency who are voting for us, they are voting for us on the basis of our religious identity. So if we leave the Islamic identity, even from our name, we will lose our audience or our popular support. And this is one opinion. The other opinion, and I believe that it is not a correct opinion, it says that if we leave the dawah associations and we leave them and abandon them, they will be controlled by the government of the Kurdistan region, which is secular, more secular. So, in short, the Islamic current in Kurdistan of Iraq is a weak, marginal current, and it has no influence on the future of the region for the reasons that I have discussed above. And thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Osman, for your presentation. Dr. Osman started by speaking on the historic background of the Islamic activity in Kurdistan. He said that the political activity has its roots in the 19th century, where the scholars of Kurdistan started working through the Sufi groups against the Al-Ittihad wa Taraqi that wanted to secularize the country. These Sufi movements or Sufi groups used to mobilize people against the Al-Ittihad and Al-Taraqi, and there was some groups like Al-Naqshbandi group that defended two things: the Kurdish identity and the implementation of Sharia against Mustafa Kemal, who removed the Sharia from or the rule of the Sharia from the country. So it started this is the historic background. It doesn't start as a reaction to the occupation. It was weak, however, and there were some individuals who were influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, but their activity in general was weak because the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, it was a nationalist Arabist organization or the current, and they didn't pay attention to any priority or any attention to the Kurdish issue, and they were and they didn't include any of that in their literature. So they didn't have that influence in Kurdistan. And when the Islamic Republic of Iran started, they said that when the Islamic country, when an Islamic state is established, all of these ethnic differences will disappear. And the secular movement in Kurdistan, Iraq is more prevailing, so they were marginal. There is also another aspect of the Islamic movement that was established. It is the Islamic Association in Kurdistan that was affected by the Jihadi Salafi movement in Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And there were also different sides within the Islamic movement. One aspect that was led by the Sheikh Ali Bakir, and other Salafi Jihadi movement that was called Ansar al-Islam, that was influenced by the thoughts of Al-Qaeda. In 1994, the Muslim Brotherhood had also another current within the Kurdistan, and it is the Islamic University. It is called the Islamic University, and it is a Kurdistan branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. He said that the Islamic movement, the future of the Islamic movement is not promising. It may not succeed because right now they are marginal and they are isolated from the Kurdish sphere because of subjective problems within the movement. It is also an elitist group, and it lacks constituency, and they have they don't take initiative, and they don't modernize their practices or their vision. In the recent elections in 2021, they shrank and they lost some of the seats. A new party that was established received 11 seats, whereas all of the Islamic movements in Kurdistan, they got only 5 seats in the parliament. There is no regional or international support for the Islamic movement. For example, the nationalist movement in Kurdistan are receiving support from regional powers, whereas the Islamic movement doesn't receive any political or material support from the region or beyond. He gave 2 examples of that the Islamic movement could have benefited from the Islamic Republic of Iran, but at the time they went to Saudi Arabia to receive support, so Iran looked at them as a Wahhabi hostile movement. And the other example was in dealing with Turkey. They were unable, also the Islamic movement couldn't receive any support from the Turkish government, and he said that Sheikh Ali Bakir rejected to say that the PKK, which is a very important matter for the Turks and the Turkish government, he rejected to say that it is a terrorist group, which made that Turkey will not support them. And even the Muslim Brotherhood branch of the Islamic movement, they couldn't work with the justice and development. And when they came to Turkey in the strategic planning summit, they said that we want the independence of the broad Kurdistan, or the great Kurdistan, which includes parts of Turkey. And this is a provocative to the Turks as well. So they are always, in addition to that, the Islamic movement in Kurdistan and in other places, they are always under the threat of being called terrorists or extremists, whereas the secular movements are always receiving support. Members of the Islamic movement are not talking about the corruption or any mismanagement that they have, because they don't have experience in management. It is very important to understand that the Kurds are the owners of these territories. They are not occupiers, they are not invaders, and they are not coming from outside to build settlements just like the Israelis. And the backwardness of the Islamic movement is because of the lack of separation between the dawah activity and the political activity, because the politics requires some political means that might affect or influence or negatively affect the dawah activity, but he says that the Islamic movement is under the threat that if they lose, or some people in the Islamic movement say that if they abandon the Islamic name or the Islamic nature of their movement, they will lose their constituency and they will not vote for them in the first place. Thank you very much, Dr. Othman. Now we will move to the comments, and we will start with the first comment by Mr. Anas At-Takriti. The floor is yours, Mr. Anas.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, peace be upon you all. I would like to start by thanking my dear brother, Dr. Sami Alarian, Professor Sami Alarian, and his center, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs in Sabah Din Zaim University. And also I would like to greet all of the dear guests who presented their papers, Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Saad, and Dr. Othman. All the papers have been very valuable, and the presentations of those papers have been very helpful. I believe it has offered a good portrayal of the multiple dimensions of the Islamic movement in Iraq, given the complexity of the situation in Iraq. But I believe that it is also important probably to tackle certain issues which I believe would either complement or bridge some of the gaps that have been left unanswered, or could offer some analysis or an in-depth reading of some of the things my colleagues have mentioned in positive or negative terms. What I would like to point out, and I am aware of I'm conscious of time here, undoubtedly everybody agrees that the Islamic movement in Iraq is an extension of the Islamic movement in the region, in the Arab and Islamic world. And so as an extension, it takes over the advantages and disadvantages thereof. So, like scholars say, there is some sort of common DNA between those Islamic movements. So you find common denominators between those who have never met and who may be in disagreement on certain aspects, but there are some deep common grounds between Iraqis and Moroccans who are Islamists, for example. You find a lot of common grounds, some of which are positive and some are not so positive. The other issue is that there are also common denominators in the discourse. Everybody talked about the discourse, which is elitist and marginalizes the bulk of the public constituency, which are the target of those Islamic movements and parties. And this is an issue that I believe cannot be denied, or no one disagrees with. And also one may talk about this in more depth had we have time, but the discourse that is idealist or principle based and value based is in itself not the problem, but the problem is when it clashes with reality, and the reality is far from perfect and far from value based, as you mentioned. The third issue, which I believe constitutes a crisis, which is the nation versus the national. So this Ummah-based discourse, the Islamic Ummah discourse, this discourse which may make the people in the Islamic movement in Iraq address Muslims in Malaysia, in South Africa, in Morocco, etc. But how can this be adapted also to the demands and needs and reality of Iraq and the Iraqi Islamic movement? I believe this is a problematic issue. I remember that in our discussions with Dr. Saad, he always said that the Iraqi Islamists know all the details of the Palestinian cause, the Tunisian cause, the Moroccan cause, but you don't find many Moroccans who know a lot about Iraq to a large extent. So what are the reasons for this phenomenon? I don't know. This might require some social or psychological debate or to understand this phenomenon. And because of this extension, I believe there are three issues that were touched upon by my colleagues in one way or another. And by the way, I would second your choice to focus on the Sunni Islamic movement, but I believe that many aspects are common with the Kurdish and Shia Islamic movements. The first factor is the idea of secrecy or secret work. Also, although secrecy is no longer in practice the way it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but the impact of those decades of secrecy on the mechanisms and the psychology of the Islamists in their attitude towards the community, towards the regime, etc. That era of secrecy casts its shadows up till now. The other issue is the issue of weapons or arms, and I mean those who have taken up arms and those who have quit or given up their arms. And in both cases, I believe this has been very influential in the practice, the evolution, and the relationships of those Islamic movements. And the other issue is the stance or position from the regime, and undoubtedly it's by and large a negative attitude or position. Of course, if those regimes may be said to be autocratic or interest-based or profiteers, etc. But given that we are talking about the reality of the Islamic movement, so the point is that this Islamic movement, with its extension, because at its influence with what happens in Egypt, in Syria, or elsewhere, to the Islamic movement, this inevitable opposition, rivalry with existing regimes, and sometimes outright conflict, I believe this is an issue that has to be studied and examined, and in Iraq it is a part of that. The Islamic movement in Iraq is no exception to that. In other words, the irony is that this Islamic movement, which is an extension of the Islamic movement in the region, has stood by and large and a very negative stance from the Islamic movement in Iraq. So the extension outside Iraq had a negative attitude towards the Islamic movement in Iraq in 2003 when they decided to engage in the political process. The Muslim Brotherhood and other movements took a very negative attitude. And I remember that in many meetings, many of my brothers, the Islamists from Iraq, they would refuse to join the meeting, and those Islamists from Iraq were there because they consider them cooperating with the American occupation. But on the other hand, the impact of what happens on Islamists elsewhere in Tunisia or elsewhere reflects, or Egypt, etc., reflects on the Islamists in Iraq. Also, and I'll try to be brief, in addition to the dichotomies mentioned by Dr. Saad, there is another one which Dr. Othman mentioned, which is society versus the state, or if you say the dawah versus the political aspect of work. And this is the dialectic that is very profound and very problematic, and sometimes causes not really dissent, but one of the ideas that were for the credit of the Islamic movement in Iraq, that despite the pressures, the enormous pressure from inside and outside, the dissent was minimal. I believe this is for the credit of the Islamic movement in Iraq. But this question of dichotomy, the society versus the state, was essential and has not been answered, even when we say that there is no difference between dawah and politics. The implementation of this separation or this no contrast principle was not clear in practice. Of course, we talked a lot, particularly Mr. Ibrahim talked about the corrupt environment in which everybody is working. And the question which occurred to me as I was listening to Mr. Ibrahim, if we remember that it is a corrupt environment, we have sectarianism, we have quota system, we have, what is the meaning or connotation of success in this corrupt environment? So let's say that this party, which is value-based, is successful within a corrupt environment. What's the connotation? There has to be a contrast. Either the party is corrupt or the environment is not corrupt. So more or less, failure in a corrupt environment may be an advantage, actually, or a compliment, not a bad thing. But to end this on a positive note, not to defend the Islamic movement in Iraq, but to shed a little positive light. Let me, first of all, shed light on the Islamic movement in the Sunni Arab as well as Kurdish context. They have solved the idea, the problem of democratic practice. This question, if you remember, in the 90s and in the 2010 or the first decade of the millennium, all the debates with the West were on the practice of democracy by Islamists. But this issue has been solved. It's no longer a question. First of all, for the outside, democratic participation has become part of the practices or the principles recognized internationally, even with the situation in Iraq. But what is more important, as I believe, is the internal democratic practice. So many of the people or the parties who participate in democratic practice in elections, etc., do not have democratic process within their own ranks. But if you look at the political arena in Iraq, where you have many large parties as well as hundreds probably of smaller parties, the Islamic movement is one of the very few where you have a change within the ranks of the Secretary General, the political officer, etc. While in other major parties you have just the same figures and the same people, and they actually inherit even the positions or titles. So you have 5 to 6 secretary generals that changed over the past years, for example, in the Islamic movement or in the Islamic Party. The other issue is the idea of diversity. Dr. Saad, for example, mentioned the historical evolution of the Islamic movement. One of the important things that has to be pointed out is that the officials of the Islamic movement of Iraq, we find a Kurdish figure, and we also have Turkmen people such as the representative of the party at the beginning of political practice, and also among the leading figures, Ali Baba, Hakim al-Hassani, and others. And Dr. Saad is even closer to the situation. There was no problem there, so that there was no talk about whether they should be there because they're Kurd or Turkmen or not. It wasn't the case, and the decisions were not made in that way. I don't want to take much longer, but I would like to conclude that the question that remains before the Islamic movement across the spectrum, and of course the Shia Islamic movement has its own peculiarity, because many of the questions are already solved for it because they have their reference. There are many issues that have been answered. So one of the questions in the Sunni community usually is that, do we really need a sort of reference in order to solve our problems? Undoubtedly, the presence of this point of reference solves a lot of the questions, but the question remains, what does the Islamic movement in Iraq want? By the way, I thought about something when Dr. Othman was speaking, that the greatest winner in the latest elections in 2021, those who received all the votes or most of the votes, they were the Kurdistan Islamic Party, right? This in itself. So one of the issues that I underlined in my notes, which is this mention of the lack of constituency for the Islamic movement, but how can I say that there is lack of constituency when the most important or the largest winner was an Islamist at the end of the day? So I believe there are major questions to be answered by the Islamic movement in Iraq, and unfortunately some are not up to this movement to answer because they are governed by some factors that are beyond its control for historical, regional, or ideological reasons, but they need to be addressed anyway. Thank you so much, and sorry for taking too long. Thank you, Dr. Anas, for what you mentioned. I also would like to say at this time that we were expecting a fourth speaker, Dr. Hussain Shaban, but unfortunately we have a snowstorm right now. He was supposed to come to Istanbul to join us in person, but because of this snowstorm he had to travel, and it was problematic to have him as a speaker in this session. Now we have our second commentator, Dr.Hadi Al-Masoumi from Tehran. Can you hear me, Dr. Hadi?
دكتور هادي تسمعني؟ طيب أنا يمكن هو مش في
I don't know if Dr. Hadi is on the Arabic channel. Dr. Hadi, can you hear me? Your microphone is muted. Can you please unmute your microphone?
دكتور هادي تسمعني؟
Dr. Hadi, can you hear me?
طيب. الدكتور هادي معنا ولكن لا أعلم لماذا لا يسمعني. سنحاول الاتصال به ومحاولة.
We will try to contact Dr. Hadi over the phone to address this technical issue. I believe we have some time for discussion. There have been some questions that we have received and that I hope that our speakers would discuss in their responses. One of the questions is about the opinion of the point of reference, the Shia reference, and their point of view towards the situation in Iraq right now, and also the role of Saudi Arabia in Iraq. And there may be something we could say about the impact or the influence of those states on the situation in Iraq. And another question about lessons learned now after about 20 years of experience with the seeking the help of the occupier to using the seeking the help of the occupier to throw the tyrant, and this is something that continues to be the demand of other peoples, such as in Libya and Syria. But your experience has been for 20 years. So what would you say about that? And also another question, is democracy really the answer? We noticed in the democracy conference, which was held in the White House in last December, that Iraq was the only country that was invited from the Middle East. But given the dependency and lack of independence, would liberal democracy be a solution, or do we need comprehensive revolution in which the state is reconstructed and the state institutions are reconstructed before a democratic process is introduced? The other question is that now with the Iraqi experience, which can be summarized being the form of governance based on sectarian power sharing, for 20 years the sects are determined for each position in the political arena. Was it a healthy aspect of political practice, and do you think it was successful? If not, what is the alternative and how can it be introduced? All of those questions need to be answered. We would like them to be discussed by our speakers in their answers. And actually, the Iraqi experience may be advanced, not necessarily positively. It goes beyond many of the theoretical and literature issues addressed in much of the literature. So it requires examining those questions or probing an answer to those questions in order to understand the positive and negative aspects in this, because we have about 45 minutes, so we can elaborate. But let me try one last time whether Dr. Hadi can hear me. Dr. Hadi. Yes, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, peace be upon you.
نعم أراك الآن.
I can see you now, good. Can you hear me too? Now, can you go to the bottom of the page and press the interpretation button? Choose the Arabic channel. You have 12 to 15 minutes. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, peace be upon you. Dr.Sami Alarian, I thank you and thank my brothers in Zaim University, and thank all the speakers. It was such a rich experience listening to the different presentations and papers, and the openness, non-fanatic tone used by my colleagues, the speakers, and I believe that this is the first time I participate in such a debate where I hear neutral, objective academic papers away from fanaticism or the media exaggerations, etc. There are a few points I would like to share on my part. As Dr. Al-Abadi mentioned, that the Islamic movements in Iraq were largely peaceful. This is quite accurate. And also the secret work was because of the tyranny and hypocrisy at the time. So the interactions with the authority were from Al-Badri to Al-Baqir al-Sadr, they were all either assassinated or imprisoned or exiled. So all those who were active in the Islamic movement were either tortured or exiled. So secrecy was not something of a choice, but they were coerced to go into secrecy. And this deprived them from popular constituency. During this time, I met many activists in Al-Dawa Islamic Party over the past few months, and the situation was quite dire for them because they can't find actually any prospects apart from either exile or a prison or execution, and this caused them to go into secrecy. As for the public constituency, as my colleagues mentioned, since 2003, after the elections in Iraq, and even in the most recent elections, I wrote a detailed paper about the results of the recent elections, despite the the demise or the lack of constituency of all parties, the Islamists, the Shia, the Sunni, as well as the secularists, due to the performance of since 2003 and and failing to meet the demands of the popular, the public. But in comparison to the secularists, the popular support for Islamic movements, particularly Shia, remained larger than secular parties. And I believe that the movements that are considered to be Islamist or that have an Islamic character, the Shia, Al-Bayt al-Shia or the Shia party received more than 150 seats, but the seculars within that took only 10 to 20. You find about 30 independents, some who are civil and some who are Islamists, but the alliances that are secular only received 9 seats in those elections. So I believe that in comparison, the 62% of course of the Iraqi people did not participate in the vote, but from those who participated, 38%, that is, they favored the Islamist movements and parties. This is on the one hand, but there are important issues to be discussed or points to be made. First of all, I believe that the Islamic movement and parties in the 90s let go of the idea of an Islamic government. And I don't believe that after 2003 there is any movement. Of course, at the level of persons or individuals. There are, but we don't have an overwhelming or a strong movement, whether Shia or Sunni, who are working to establish an Islamic government based on Sharia, apart from the jihadis in the Sunni component and a few figures in the Shia component. So we can't call those in the Shia or Sunni components Islamists in the accurate sense of the word, as they have given up this demand and they actually say that they don't want Islamic rule, and they say it publicly. Some of the clear and most well-known figures in both components. The other issue is that Islamist movements, because of their exclusion from power over the past decades, they always played the role of the opposition. They were excluded, they were exiled or imprisoned. So they don't have a clear approach or understanding of power. Of course, they have generalizations, general principles, but they don't have a practical action plan to manage society which sees modernization, modernism. So the people do not go to the Stone Ages. Those people have changed a lot, and they have access and they know what's happening in the world. So what they demanded from their government is welfare, service provision, etc. And the third issue is, I believe, that some of the speakers as well as many of the papers elsewhere do not pay enough attention to something that's very important if we are to study the Islamic experience in Iraq, which is that we have to understand that this Islamic experience was within the context of occupation. It's not in void, it's not in vacuum, and it's not without a context. The experience in Iraq of the Islamic movement started under the foreign occupation, which took over the affairs of Iraq, and there were certain determinants of how the Islamic movement would deal with that reality. So if they leave the political arena and sit home and let the seculars take over, they would lose everything. But if they engage, they would face the issue of blame and dialectics. But as we know, politics depends on making a decision. So as a theorist, you can choose what to talk about and what to avoid. But in politics, you have to make a decision to choose the bad over the worst. So some took the decision to resist and some took the decision to engage. So over the past 19 years, this experience was not in vacuum. So the United States and even the United Nations actually recruited, or sorry, stripped Islamists from their rights in many ways, and they also shook the structures of the Islamists. If we look at the experience of Islamists in Iraq, and there is a study I have made on this that is under translation that I will share with you shortly. The United States tried to strip the Islamists from their rights. For example, you would find that the Americans were speaking openly that the United States and the United Nations have agreed on not giving the critical or sensitive positions to Islamists, such as the prime ministry. So instead of playing an impartial role, they were biased and they held a certain party. So they rejected any influence of Islamists on strategic positions. But if you consider those who were elected in Iraq after 2003, at least half of the ministries were with the seculars. That's in quantity, but in terms of quality, they were hugely supported in media terms, financially and politically, in the face of Islamists. And on the other hand, there was a lot of pressure on the Islamists to give up on many of the projects and views that they held. For example, the oil sector, the banking or the central bank, the security sectors, those important and strategic sectors, regardless of who takes that ministry, the United States has to vet the people who take over those files, because the revenues of oil mostly go to the United States. And also in terms of electricity, the Iraqi government went to Germany, but then the foreign ministry or the state secretary of the United States called the Iraqis and told them and threatened them. And even Germany said that they wanted to help, but the United States would not accept intervention by Germany. So what I am trying to say is that this experience, regardless of the successes and failures, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't in normal circumstances. It was under much pressure. But there are some critics or critique to Islamic movements after 2003. Both Shia and Sunni, there is a lot of tribalism and sectarianism in their discourse, and also the quota or power sharing, unfortunately. And this has caused a lot of fissures within the Islamic movement itself and between the Shia and Sunnis on the other. And this allowed rival non-Islamic movements to marginalize or defame the Islamic movement. And more importantly, the corruption. Of course, everybody, even the seculars, are accused of corruption, but we would have thought that the Islamic movement figures would refrain from engaging in this huge corruption, causing a lot of problems for the reputation of Islamic movement. Another problem was not giving the opportunity to young people in Islamic movement. So you would find that young people are not given the opportunity in the Islamic movement, and leading them to be disappointed and leaving the Islamic movement towards secular or civil movements. The final point is that until now, Islamic movements do not have a specific action plan or project to provide services and welfare for the people. We know that over those decades, we have moved to the point where people want welfare and services. Yes, people are still voting for Islamists more than they vote for seculars, but they need welfare and service provision. And the problem is, how would the Islamic movement solve those issues as the Iraqi people are looking to the Gulf states and compare them with Mosul, Basra, and Baghdad. And but does the Islamic movement in Iraq has a specific plan to address this issue of service provision? I believe the future of the Islamic movement depends largely on the presence of such a plan and understanding, or a project for service provision and welfare provision for the people in the future. Now we move to the last part of this session. Each of our speakers will have less than 10 minutes to give their final comments and remarks, and also try to address the questions we have mentioned. Mr. Ibrahim, peace be upon you all once again. I hope that my voice is well heard. Yes, yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you so much for the comments offered on those papers. I personally talked verbally apart, or presented my paper apart from the text of my paper, but Dr. Sami, I believe, has the full version of my paper, and I don't know if you can share it with my colleagues, but I tried in my presentation to summarize the critical view of the reality of the Islamic movement in Iraq, particularly the Shia movement. Of course, all Islamic movements have many problems, and we agreed that many of them are structural and essential, and some are based on the circumstances and the practices and the situation in our countries. But in order to be specific in our remarks or in our discussion, let me start with the ideas one by one. The remark I loved by Dr. Anas is that if the environment is corrupt, then lack of success by the Islamic movement is actually a success or a compliment, because it means that they are not corrupt. Now the corrupt situation, and I am an Islamist myself, and I claim that because of the bad practice and because people did not take caution against this environment, and because they did not crystallize a vision for their work, the Islamic movement has unintentionally contributed to this corrupt cycle of corruption, because the situation in Iraq was not so complex and so corrupt as it is now. We had a devastated nation and population, and the Islamic movement, despite all the pressures, should have done better, but I believe it was mostly stricken by the lack of a crystallized vision. And let me also be clear about lack of the immunity on the individual level that would have helped those who were put in executive or political offices to be a model or to set an example for this devastated population. This did not happen, and they became part of the corruption cycle, and the Islamic movement became held captive to this corrupt situation, unfortunately. The other point made by Dr. Sami about the role of the Shia reference, I intentionally did not mention it because for the Shia, this reference has its specificity, and it's not considered part of the Islamic movement or the political sphere. They have their religious and political views, but they are actually the reference for seculars and Islamists, because they proved through their vision and their comprehensive understanding of the situation in Iraq, they have proven to be the rational and the only rational actor in Iraq. Everybody else have made mistakes or contributed to this corrupt situation, or tried to be, or unintentionally became part of this failure in Iraq. The other issue that I want to point out is the issue of democracy. All Islamists, Sunnis, and Shia did not seek democracy out of conviction, but because they had to. Only recently, Islamists were attacking democracy, saying that it's non-Islamic and that it constitutes infidelity. It gives the upper hand to ignorant majorities, and it could be monopolized by capitalists or businessmen or oligarchs, etc. And it is a system of hegemony. However, they did not support or develop any alternatives. So when they were faced with the political practice, democracy was their vehicle to power. So they had to accept it, and some of them wanted it to be a one-way carrier to get them to power without ever quitting power. So this has to be taken into consideration. Until now, Islamists have a problem with democracy, unlike what Dr. Anas mentioned. Actually, the literature of Islamists is not reconciliatory with democracy. At best, they look at it as a mechanism, not as a governance philosophy. And you can see this through the a problem of Islamists engaging in democracy, looking at it as a mechanism to reach power rather than a philosophy of governance. The other issue in relation to the specificity of Iraq, yes, Iraq has its own character, and the Islamic movement in Iraq is divided and represents a number of parties or strata. There is Arab and Kurd, there is and Turkmen, there is Shia and Sunni. So there is a multiplicity or plurality in the Islamic movement. But would the choice, the vote of Islamists indicate that people still prefer Islamists over other actors? I believe we have to read into this beyond the dichotomy of Islamists versus secular, because some of those lines have become so blurred as the new people who affiliate with those parties and who go to the parliament through those elections are not necessarily a third or second generation from Islamists, and they do not subscribe to the ideology of that party necessarily, but there is a sort of communal understanding of who would vote for whom. So I would not count on the reading too much into the majority vote of Islamists. But I agree with Dr. Hadi, however, on the idea that Islamists have not agreed on the program of governance. Our understanding of the theory of the governance of the politics is based on an imagined Islamic rule. We cannot recall the Sultanate or the empire, which ended with the Ottoman Empire, but we cannot, on the other hand, claim that we have developed a new Islamic model based on the modern state form. So we are still affiliated with the Sultanate ideology while we use the state tools. This is in itself problematic and requires the Islamic movement to develop its theories and literature and to accept some of that we could learn from other human experiences. This is one of the challenges all over the Islamic world, and I have to point out that the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, their experience may give enlighten the other Islamic parties in or movements across the Islamic world because they were flexible, because they did not focus on religious or political legitimacy from the very beginning. They would have clashed with the seculars from the beginning, but they were smart about it and they considered and examined the situation in Turkey very minutely, and they were able to overcome the challenges or the obstacles that may have uh, hindered their political participation, and they went or based their rule on the uh, overall objective, the quality of life, social service, and well-being or welfare. And afterwards, they would use on the idea-based uh, uh, awareness raising.
So we can get out of the comparison of what has the Islamic movement got into of the problems and the crises. Nevertheless, the Islamic current, the Islamic movement is still active and is still working, but it is in a time of a drop down, but this drop down can lead to a new successes if the members of the Islamic movement can get away from the mafia-like and the interests-like approaches. Thank you very much. And now we move to Dr. Saad Al-Kubaisi. You have 10 minutes. Dr. Saad, we can't hear you. Are you on the Arabic channel?
الآن تمام؟
نعم نسمعك الآن، تفضل.
Yes, we can hear you now.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. حقيقة إن شاء الله
In the name of God. I'm not going to speak for a long time. In a former seminar, I said that when we were young in the 90s, we were looking, and I'm living in the Anbar province, we were chatting in a kind of dreaming. In the 90s, the regime was very strong, and we have never imagined that there will be occupation and the regime will be toppled, and we will see what we have seen afterwards. So we used to say that if there was any change, regardless what kind of change is that, how the Shia and Sunni and the Kurds, and specifically the Islamists among them, will be living together. When we were young, when in our 20s, what we were discussing is that the Sunni and Shia and Kurdish Islamists will be one block in the parliament because they are coming out of the same backgrounds, despite the peculiarities of their different belongings. But in terms of the governance and the power, we suppose that they agree on over 90% of the such details. However, what happened after 2003 was completely the opposite. and maybe the ethnic and religious tensions prevailed and brought each party to get back to their original identities or sub-identities. So here we need to speak about the political interests. And I'm not saying here that the interest is not legitimate by necessity, but what I want to say is that the political reality, how sometimes it can be stronger than the ideology in so many cases. So regardless about no matter how strong the principles and the ideals are strong and the ideology is strong, the reality and conditions will prevail over the people. So maybe the inability not only of the Sunnis and Shia, but the Islamic movement of Iraq and the Islamic movement of Kurdistan might be two copies of the same thing, but one of them is with an Arab copy and the other one is the Kurdish copy. But there was no agreement amongst them in this regard or any revision about their ideology or their political thought. Another point, I would like to remind you of something that we should remember all the time, which is that the Islamists will remain there. And even if they are shrinking now or they are dropping down, that's true, but they will never disappear because of several reasons. Because the religious and the belief aspects of the people will remain there. And there is a very important aspect, which is the lack of any convincing alternative. Unfortunately, in our countries, the leftist and liberal nationalist and the Ba'athist groups, they also they are to blame for the situation that we got into. So, unfortunately, we find that the Sadr current is getting about 73 seats, which means around 1/4 of the parliament. And the Sadr current is Islamist par excellence, not only Islamist, it is an ideological Islamist group or party. So when we say that the Islamic current or the Islamic movements are drawing back, however, the other alternatives are not very attractive. On the other hand, on the contrary, if there is some corruption amongst the Islamic groups, the others are not better. So we are seeing a reproduction of the long decades where non-Muslims or non-Islamists governed our countries. There is another point, which is an academic and a methodological point about comparison between the Islamic Kurds, Shia, and Sunni groups. In the beginning of my presentation, I said that Iraq might be one of the most complex countries to understand the detailed or the tiny details of its components. When we need to when we compare between these two components, we need to have a precise factors. For example, the religious aspect, which is present in the Shia sphere, which has influence on the Shia parties. They are not present at all amongst the Sunni groups. Not at all. And if they are present, they are in a very limited phase, not because the Sunnis are weak, but the nature of the Sunni school of thoughts in a lot of its details. What we see, for example, in the Shia school of thought is the following the living leader of the school of thought, or one of the leaders. We don't see that in the Sunni school of thought. So even when we have a Sunni Islamic group, even if it is Islamist, so they don't have to follow a certain religious fatwa or a religious dress code. They can learn from it, but they don't have to follow it to the letter. And when we talk about the Kurdish groups, they are linked with the grievance of the Kurdish problem and the issue of the independence. And for decades, they have been trying to get in line the idea of the Salafist Islam or the Sufi Islam and the comprehensive thinking of Islam and the issue of the state and the self-determination, etc., etc. That's why I'm saying methodologically we need to be very careful about the comparison and not to put the ideas of the Islamists and their relations and their motives in one basket. Maybe this applies to Egypt, to Turkey, or to other countries, but in Iraq, it is completely different, and the comparison should be very careful when we do that. One final point, which is the point of the literature. If we look at the literature of the Kurdish Islamists, we find that there is a narrative. They believe in the theory of caliphate, and we find that they believe in it even in its traditional form. And we see that the Islamists who belong to the Muslim Brotherhood, they believe in the caliphate, but in a more modern model. So they don't have, for example, to commit to the name itself, etc., etc. And we now, if we look at the Sunni Islamists, we find that we have some level of these two visions. For example, the Islamic movement has this understanding of the modern caliphate, whereas the jihadi Salafist current looks at the more traditional understanding of the caliphate. So objectively, for example, the Shia groups, they believe in the wilayat al-faqih, or the leadership of the religious leader. They believe in that strongly, whereas we find another group, like for example the Islamic Dawah Party. They believe in an Islamic Shia state that governs by the rules of Islam, and it's fine to have shura or consultation, or even uh, getting closer with some Sunni groups. That's fine with them. What I want to mention here is that the problems with the literature is found in all groups. That's why I say that the idea of an Islamic state, it might be very potential to be present in Pakistan, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia, or in the Levant, or even Egypt, but in Iraq, with its current condition, with the current literature, unless there are general understandings that everybody agrees on, then we might need to ask for the commonalities, which is the state of citizenship where everyone is equal in terms of
بأن لا يكون
the rights and duties.
أولى ودرجة
If we
ثانية
reach that,
كبير
and not to have citizens of second grade, that will be such an achievement in Iraq. And if the political parties in their three major currents can reach that inclusive state, that will be even better. But I believe now all the literature, including from starting with the Islamists, they need to focus on the state of citizenship where everyone is equal in rights and duties. Of course, the state of citizenship doesn't mean that we abandon Sharia. We can find in the state of citizenship a lot of points from the Sharia and from the religious understanding, is especially the point of the equality in rights and duties is an Islamic point to start with. So that's why I would like to say that the situation in Iraq requires tools of analysis that are different from other countries. Sometimes I feel tired or when someone asks me to explain the situation in Iraq. I say it is it's impossible. Where shall I to start and where to finish? So actually, these are the comments that I have, and thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you very much, Dr. Saad. And the final word by Dr. Othman Ali, and we will conclude. Thank you very much, Dr. Sami, and I would like to thank the other speakers. I want to answer some of the questions that you asked, Dr. Sami. The matter of the foreign aspects in the journey of the Islamic work in Iraq. Unfortunately, the foreign factor has always been negative in general. The people of Iraq, unlike a lot of other peoples, the sectarianism wasn't part of our culture, and there are a lot of evidence on that. For example, in the Kurdistan branch of Muslim Brotherhood, we had some Shia members in that, and there were a lot of incidents where Shia and Sunni dealt and cooperated with each other. Although I am from Kirkuk, but I know that in Baghdad there were marriages between Shia families and Sunni families, and the school of thought was not a problem amongst them. Unfortunately, after the Islamic revolution and the influence of the Salafist school of thought, and here I mean the Shia Salafist and the Sunni Salafist, that was influenced by the Saudi Arabia, it affected the people in Iraq in a very negative way. I was in a summit in the United States in 1991. There was a professor called Rashid. His name is Rashid, and he said that the uprising that took place in March, some people came from Iran and they created chaos, and the Iraqi army managed to oppress them. And he said that we are Sunni in Iraq, and the future of Iraq is for us. After he finished, I said to him, you are sympathizing with an army that was brutal in reacting to the uprising that happened in the north and the south, because it is Sunni, or because the afflicted area was not wasn't Sunni. How come you sympathize with the army, and you call those people in the that they are kafir, and how will you live with them in the future if you call them as such? Of course, that person, Mr. Rashid, was very tempered, and he asked, "Who are you to say that?" And said, "Regardless, who am I? I'm asking you a straight question." So the Salafist ideology that came from Saudi Arabia and the extremist ideology that came from Iran affected negatively the work of the Islamic movements in Iraq. This is a reality that we need to acknowledge. Another point that we need to acknowledge as well, which is the matter of democracy, or the question of democracy. I believe that in 1987, I visited Mr. Najmuddin Arbakan, and he mentioned an incident, and he said that the question of democracy is like the question of Moses' stick. He said that Moses was not a, a magician, but the magic at the day was like democracy today. So Muslims should master the democratic game. Some, of course, people here understand some of the Western theorizing people who says that they think of one vote and one elections, and once they come to power, they will not leave the power. And this is also for the Islamists who suffered a lot from the oppression that was supported by the West. So, although some Islamists did wrong in democracy because they didn't have, they were not convinced with the philosophy of democracy, as one of the speakers said, but the Islamists also are the victims of the extremist secularism that is supported by the West. So when we speak about democracy, we need to, or democracy and Islam, so we need to mention these two points at the same level. The other point, I believe that the experience from 2003 until today in Iraq had a drawback on the Islamists. Mr. Hadi is saying that the Sadr movement had more seats, but here we need to say that more than 70% of the people didn't vote in the elections. And who is leading Iraq now? The Islamists. Although the Americans are have hegemony over Iraq, but there are Iranians as well having hegemony over parts of Iraq. So we need to make serious revision of the literature and the practice of the Islamic movements. I agree with a lot of people who say that the Islamists will never disappear. They will stay there. But it is time to revise their visions and to work in other ways and in other formulas. Here I would like to say something, which is the Islam that is based on the purposes should be the philosophy that leads the theory of governance amongst the Islamists. The Iraqi people require services, projects, development projects that can bring back the dignity to the Iraqi people and bring back coexistence in Iraq. In Iraq, we are living a very brutal period where the Shia is killing the Sunni and the Sunni is killing the Shia, the Arab is killing the Kurd, and vice versa. It is not a good time, and unfortunately they are doing that under the names of the Islamic parties. So this requires, this need to change. how many votes did the Islamic parties used to take in the past, and how much they are receiving now? So there should be revision, and to have a theory of Islam that is built on the purposes of the higher purposes of Islam, away from the traditional framework. Thank you. Thank you very much for all the speakers today in this symposium. I would like to thank Mr. Ibrahim Al-Abadi from Baghdad, Mr. Saad Kubaisi from Istanbul, and Dr. Othman Ali from Toronto, and Mr. Sakarya from London, and Mr. Hadi Masoumi from Tehran. Thank you all. The second session will be after about 1 hour and a half. It will be at 3 o'clock Istanbul time, or 12 o'clock GMT time. It will be about the Islamic movement in Kuwait, and we will have 3 distinguished speakers. So stay tuned with us, and tomorrow we will have 2 other sessions. The first one will be about the United Arab Emirates in 10:30 Istanbul time, and it will be followed by another session about Saudi Arabia at 3 o'clock Istanbul time as well.